Hello, and welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda, but we have a little bit of a mix-up this week, and by mix-up, I mean the usual co-host, Jackson, is currently far away across the ocean. So instead, we brought in our first ever guest episode. Welcome, Cori.
Hello. I am a friend of the podcast, and fancy myself a little bit of a movie buff as well. So that's about it.
And so we brought her on just to kind of give us a little bit of a new perspective to see some different things, like the movie that she recommended this week, which I would have never, ever seen us doing if it weren't for her suggestion, which is Little Miss Sunshine. It is, in my opinion, an exercise in misery. It was a movie that I was not prepared for in the least, but Cori chose it. So I'm going to ask you right now, why?
Well, I mean, okay. So, first of all, it's a movie that I've seen a lot of times because I like a lot of the actors. You know, Alan Arkin is great in it. Abigail Breslin in one of her first roles besides Signs. I like Toni Collette a lot. Steve Carell in one of his first dramatic roles before, becoming an Oscar contender every year. But also it's just as a podcast about death, it's one of those movies that I looked at my collection of movies when you asked me to do this and was like, what would be interesting to talk about death-wise? And I think that there are a lot of instances in this movie where death plays a part in the characters and in how their attitudes towards things are changed or shifted by death, and I think some lessons are learned from death throughout the movie. So I thought that might be interesting to talk about.
I mean, I would take it a step further, honestly, and just say it's a movie almost entirely about death. It's a constant through line that just, keeps Little Miss Sunshine just a happy movie that, I was just constantly thrilled to see what happened next. It was guaranteed to be something positive and happy, right?
I mean, you would think, but one of the things that I really like about it is how they shift from being so sad to being just funny and moving on with their lives with it. There are so many jarring tonal shifts within the entire movie that I feel like mimic real life. I feel like you can't be super morose the entire time when something bad happens. There's gonna be something else going on that's gonna shift focus,
Yeah, entirely. I was, as much as I did call it an exercise in misery, I did find myself laughing more often than not, despite just feeling crummy and distinctly not liking a few characters. And I hope that that's something that you're supposed to take away from it, and it's just not me being like, I'm grumpy and hate everyone type of deal. So
no, I definitely think there are some characters that are meant to be the antagonists without really just they're meant to be the people you are not rooting for necessarily, probably.
Hopefully. Where do we want to go from here? Do you want to give a quick plot? I'll let you give a plot summary if you want.
Sure.
Before we dive into spoilers and whatnot.
Okay. So essentially, Little Miss Sunshine is about a family whose daughter gets into a pageant that they have to drive cross country to put her in, called Little Miss Sunshine. And the family is made up of a bunch of zany characters that all have their own baggage. And through a series of circumstantial things, they all have to go on this big family car trip to get her to this pageant. And hilarity ensues, and also misery ensues.
So much misery. Just that I keep coming back to that, and I apologize, but wow, was I not prepared.
It's funny because I tend to be the kind of person that doesn't like watching stuff about people being really sad, but I feel like there's enough humor in this that it balances out the sadness.
I mean, Bryan Cranston's appearance alone was just beautiful, because I had no idea he was coming in, and
I forgot that it was Bryan Cranston, to be honest.
It was so absurd. He's got a Chuck Norris mullet, and I hated it, but I loved it in every way.
Yeah. there are a lot of like random people that have gone on to do other things in this movie that I forgot existed.
They had Dwight's Nana or whatever it was from the dinner party episode of The Office.
I don't remember her. I remember there's this girl that's in Legally Blonde that I remember, and then there's this guy that's on Last Man on Earth now, that he plays the cop that picks them up. But so there's a lot of like people. I mean, it's an indie movie, so there are bound to be a lot of like random people who go on to do great things, because this movie came out 12 years ago. 13 years. Wait, what year is it? Yeah, 12 years ago. But yeah, so there's a lot of little things to take away that are fun.
So I guess with that kind of like the basics covered, are you ready to move into spoilers for this, as you said, 12-year-old movie? So I'm assuming that most people, if they are listening to this episode, either do not care about spoilers at this point or have seen this movie because it's an old one. All right, cool. So I guess we talked about this a little bit beforehand, and we kind of agreed on a character by character discussion and a kind of commentary on how they all work together, as well as how death influences their lives. And we kind of want to start this off with Frank, or Steve Carell, or the uncle. So I'll take it away. Tell us about Frank.
Okay, so it is revealed very quickly as you are introduced to Frank that the reason that he is in the story at all is because he attempted suicide and therefore has to be given to his sister, who is Cheryl, who's Toni Collette's character, to be in her custody because their insurance won't cover him staying in a hospital to be observed after his suicide attempt. So he has to go stay with the family, and they have this dinner scene where Olive, as played by Abigail Breslin, is 7 years old at this point, asks him what happened, and he tells her in detail about why his life was so terrible that it caused him to want to kill himself. Mainly, he is a academic who lost both a guy that he was in love with and a what's the award that it's not an award, it's the
it was the Proust Scholar, right?
Yeah, he's like the preeminent Proust scholar of the country, and the guy that was just below him in that both basically stole his boyfriend and also got a genius grant in the same span of time, so that caused him to be down on himself and decide to try to end his life, which he himself says, which I also failed at, which is again following up discussion of suicide with a quip about failure, and therein lies comedy.
Yeah. And that also does a really nice job of setting up the basic themes of the movie as you put them forward. Themes of failure and success, life versus death therein, and just kind of how we treat ourselves in those contexts.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of this movie, I mean, it's about a beauty contest, or well, it's based on the beauty contest is the reason for the plot to be moving, and so clearly there's a winner and there's a loser of that. But the dad being a motivational speaker about wanting to be a winner and how to be a winner, it kind of leads you to analyze how all these people either win or lose, succeed or fail in the various aspects of their lives.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to kind of see as like the story progresses, the highs and lows, and just kind of witness that even at the lowest, with Frank attempting suicide early on, how much levity comes from each scene. I mean, you put it forward yourself. He very clearly quips like, "I've even failed at that," which, despite being just incredibly dark and dour, is like a surprisingly funny line, and that comes from within the first like 3 lines of the movie itself. It very much sets up the idea of failure from the get-go, even before Richard is introduced.
Well, I think that they have Richard doing his like spiel in front of a basically empty group of like a seminar, which I think is really funny. Him doing a seminar about how to succeed in front of a clearly failing seminar worth of people, because there's like 6 people there. There's an interesting disconnect there. Him being a failed public speaker on the concept of how to succeed.
Yeah, there's a lot of things like that are very... The movie is incredibly well made in that regard, where they do a lot of setting up through visual gags. It's not so much... It thrives in the show don't tell, which a lot of I've seen a lot of movies kind of explain outright that here's my husband, he is doing this, but he's not very good at it. Whereas this, like, that opening scene of Richard shows him, it explains the irony of his situation just perfectly without having to, tell us what's happening at all.
Yeah, agreed. I think it gives the audience credit enough to be able to put those dots together without drawing the map for them.
And like that runs throughout a lot of it too, is just a constant recognition that the audience can figure out what's going on through just visual cues rather than a constant dragging you past the plot point to say, hey, look, here it is, make sure you understand this. Do you want to talk about Edwin, or do you have more to say on Frank?
Not really. I mean, I think that I did find it interesting watching, as we said, like the shifts of between comedy and between the drama and the suffering. I looked up, because I mean, I'm not academic enough to know the very academic references that they are making, but I looked into Proust a little bit, and a quote that I wrote down was, suffering makes you who you are, which makes it a very relevant person for him to specialize in the context of the movie.
I actually, in light of that, would be curious to know where the idea for this movie came from. Is this like the directors based it on a story from Proust, or is it just like they heard this quote and wanted to run with that? Because like there's a huge emphasis on Proust throughout this movie, so it would be very interesting to know the basis for it and whether it is in fact like a Proust novel that this is in some form or way based off of.
Yeah, I kind of doubt it. My guess is probably one of the writers probably just knew of him and kind of decided to tie him in as a relevant, source to pull from, like a relevant kind of Easter egg for those academic enough to recognize it.
Right. So I guess let's move on to Edwin then. Edwin is the grandfather and the second clear tie to death, in that he does die.
That'll do it.
Yeah, that'll really do it. He was at one point in a nursing home, but they had to pull him out because of a drug habit, I believe, which...
He was selling heroin, they said.
Like you do, right? I mean, come on, who hasn't?
I mean, in his defense was, I'm old and dying, why wouldn't I do drugs? Which honestly is not a bad, not a bad defense. He tells the young kids, don't do drugs, you're young, you don't need to do drugs, I'm old, I need drugs.
Yeah.
It's not an awful argument.
I mean, it isn't until it kills him.
That's true.
Because it is his ultimate undoing or it seems to be his ultimate undoing. He could have been naturally designed to die at that point anyway, but he definitely did do some drugs before that old death. So that's kind of the second big death of the movie, or near death, I suppose. He does die, though.
Yeah, and his connections, he is Richard, who is Greg Kinnear's character's father, and he is his granddaughter Olive's pageant coach.
Yeah.
And choreographer.
Yeah, which, sets up that whole idea. Like, it's not an uncommon trope for the, do it for him, he died type of thing. And it does actually his death serves as a really poignant pushing forward point. Because it becomes a matter of, we could stop here or we could push forward in his name. We've already come so far in our journey of 900 miles. Screw it, let's just go for it type of deal.
Yeah, the amount of chaos that he exhibits throughout his life makes it appropriate, the amount of chaos that follows in his death.
Oh my god.
And what comes after.
Yeah, the pageant itself is quite a little bit of a twist that I was not prepared for.
The toddlers and tiaras of it all.
Yeah, which was horribly I'm going to take a quick second to jump to the pageant, because this is a great place to say I was incredibly uncomfortable with all of that.
as you are meant to be.
Yeah, it's really unpleasant to watch. And my biggest takeaway from it, though, I will say, is the pageant announcer really should have been played by Will Arnett.
I mean, it almost was if you just look at the spray tan and the bone structure.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically discount Will Arnett. And, like, just that little extra push would have been perfect. Just taking, like, the Joe Bluth thing going on would have been great.
Yes, agreed. The saddest and most uncomfortable thing about it is I'm sure that it is very similar to how many children's pageants are run.
Yeah, I was trying to kind of keep that idea out of my head because it was really uncomfortable to me.
Yeah. And watching, the family watch the pageant before Olive comes on, again, you're supposed to kind of identify and be like, yep, this is weird. They do think it's weird as well.
Oh, yeah.
We all acknowledge that it's weird and terrible.
Yeah, Greg Kinnear was fantastic in the audience. That's another one of those scenes I was kind of watching. I'm like, some of his reactions, especially at one point, he looks directly at the camera as one of the girls is like tumbling, which tends to be, a huge no-no in movies because you don't want to acknowledge the existence of it. And so in that moment, I was kind of like, I wonder if they didn't tell him what was about to happen. If they just kind of put him there and then just put all these girls who are like clearly actually very talented people out. And just said, all right, give us your gut reaction. And so when the one girl just started like curling into a ball and rolling around, he looks directly at the camera and I'm like, that couldn't have been scripted because that looked so genuine. Like, excuse me, what did you just put in front of me?
Yes.
It was
I mean,
great.
that's the best way to get a genuine reaction is to give no warning at all whatsoever. So
yeah, it was a solid set of shots there.
Okay, so do we want to move on to the next character?
I was gonna say, do you have anything else you'd like to add about Edwin and his narcotic death?
I don't think so. I did want to point out, just for fun fact, Alan Arkin apparently won an Oscar for this role.
Really?
For Best Supporting Actor, yeah.
I was gonna say, he died pretty early on, too.
So, I mean, I love the fact that he is an Oscar winner for playing a grandpa who talks about narcotics and sex and drugs and all of this nonsense.
And then just dies.
It's pretty funny.
But yeah, let's talk about Cheryl.
Okay. So, I feel like she's the most normal of the characters, probably.
Easily the most identifiable with.
Yeah. She is just kind of your stereotypical mom, just trying to make ends meet, make things work, make everybody get along, deal with her crazy husband and his antics, and her children and their various eccentricities, and her brother that she's now responsible for, just trying to balance everything and doing it kind of, but also not.
I gotta say, I did really like how much she and Frank seemed to like genuinely like each other. It felt like a breath of fresh air in this movie where just like so much of it is around misery and death. At one point, Frank was antagonizing her husband, Richard, and she was just kind of smiling and smirking along with him, laughing at what he was doing. And it was just like a great little moment that really kind of sold those two as people who genuinely liked each other.
Yeah, there's a lot of conflict between family members in this movie, so it's nice when there are parts that allow you to see that, they do actually love each other and they are actually, on the whole, family that loves one another.
Right. That works together and isn't just constantly being bombarded by death and sadness and misery.
Yeah, similarly, I like Olive and Dwayne's relationship. Like the kids, I like that they genuinely are nice to each other and kind to one another in the context of their parents screaming at each other and their dad screaming at their grandpa and, their uncle having problems with their... Really, everybody just has problems with their dad because their dad is kind of terrible.
Yeah, a knob is a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
But no, yeah, Olive and Dwayne as the kids. We'll get to them. Don't worry. But I did just want to say to what you were saying. Like they are such genuine characters in those moments. Like they do feel like siblings. Like the times that I would have with my sister, where things would be happening and we'd kind of have like an unspoken communication back and forth, and like despite the I hate you of it all, I hate everything, I'm 16 and angry about everything, you still have that respect for your siblings because they're going through the same thing you are. And this movie does so much family dynamics so well.
Mm-hmm.
The more I talk about it, I think the more I enjoy it, kind of.
Yeah, all the characters are very like fleshed out, and how they respond to the other people in the family is different based on how their relationship is. Like it's very clear that the writers really knew who everybody was and how they related to one another in different ways.
Yeah, the family dynamic is very clear.
Okay. Other than that, I don't have a ton to say about Cheryl. I do like that she is willing to kind of roll with the punches as things get weirder and weirder.
Mm-hmm.
And Toni Collette, I just love in most things, so I was glad to have her here.
Right, and I mean, it is established in this movie that she's looking to get divorced from Richard, and it's an unhappy relationship, which just kind of brings me to the next point of she's remarried in Hereditary. So I would like to say that Hereditary is the conclusion to Little Miss Sunshine.
Well, I think the divorce because Dwayne talks about divorce, I think Dwayne has a different dad. So I think she got divorced from whoever Dwayne's dad was, and then married Richard and had Olive. I'm pretty sure that's the structure of the family tree.
Well, never mind then. You're stepping on my joke here. I'm trying to make light, and
I'm sorry.
Here it is.
Having seen this movie as many times as I have, I feel like I need to jump in with the correct family tree.
Making sure I'm factually accurate, like a good podcast should be.
Perhaps it's the prequel.
All right, I'll take that. But yeah, let's speaking of dads, let's talk about Richard.
He's exhausting to be around is the main takeaway. I love Greg Kinnear, and he's so charming in everything else except this. But every character is so visibly exhausted by him, and I can relate.
Yeah, I wanted to punch him pretty much the entire movie.
Yeah. And I don't know if it would have made it better or worse if he were that obnoxious about his 9-step program. If it were a successful program, I don't know if that would be better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I would be more okay with him being so all about himself and all about it if it actually brought him success. But just knowing that he is a failure in this enterprise that he is constantly talking about makes it so much less interesting to hear about, because you know that so little of what he's talking about is actually accurate, because clearly he's not doing so well.
Yeah, no, that's actually an interesting question, because thinking about it, if he was successful, I almost think it'd be worse, because there's an element of just we get it, shut up, and also those 9-step programs usually are kind of just making people feel bad and taking money from them type of deals.
Mm-hmm.
So a successful version of that doesn't really make me feel like I'd like him anymore.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I guess it just makes more sense to me as to why he was constantly bringing it up, because why would you constantly be talking about something that is not going well in your life?
Well, look, I've been hosting a podcast for a year, and that's doing nothing, but I talk about it to everybody. So
I guess power of what is it, the law of attraction.
Mm-hmm. You just
talk about it and it'll come to you.
Eventually it happens, That's why I put stones outside my door and stuff too. They're the power stones. It all comes back to that. But yeah, he's probably the person, it's really the parents, I would say, that see the most consequences of death, because Edwin, the grandfather, is his father. Frank is Cheryl's brother. I think arguably that they tend to be the most impacted by these deaths, with the exception of maybe Edwin and Olive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like they have different reactions to it in that I don't think that Cheryl changes much based on the deaths that happen. I think she just, like, obviously she's emotionally affected, but I think that Richard has like an actual change of heart after his dad dies and decides, okay, what is really important? Is winning the most important thing, or is family the most important thing?
Right.
And that kind of builds up to the end where he, decides that winning is not everything and having fun with your family is.
I mean, I think in Cheryl's defense, just because it does the way it's kind of framed of like, yeah, she doesn't really change much when people die. I think the big thing is that I don't think she particularly cared for Richard's father for semi good reason. He constantly yells about sex and drugs at her children.
Yeah, that's true.
And Frank doesn't actually die, so I think there's more just a sense of relief than an actual need to reevaluate your life as a result thereof.
Well, and I also feel like her priorities are already in a better, like, she already has better priorities to begin with, so she doesn't need to reevaluate her priorities, whereas clearly her husband's priorities are all over the place and he needed a recalibration.
Right. Anything else with Richard?
I don't think so. Shall we move on to the children?
Yep. Let's talk about the kids. Let's talk about Dwayne.
Okay. Paul Dano he's now moved into like writing and directing a little bit, and I like him a lot, but I like this character a lot just because it's kind of your run-of-the-mill teenager who rolls their eyes at everything, but it's also got a little bit
11.
more like, yeah, and like with a little bit more, I don't know, just hateful, like the I hate everyone written on the notepad, and his uncle asking about his family and just continuing to hold up I hate everyone. Like, it's just it is darker than a lot of the angsty teens you see, I think.
Yeah, and yet, like, it is kind of funny too, because you can still clearly see the angsty teen underneath.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are just moments that the shell cracks and you can be like, he clearly does not. It's just the persona he has chosen at the time, and wow, does it hit home a little bit.
And it's also interesting, I mean, as just from watching an actor act, the fact that he doesn't speak for, 2/3 of the movie.
Yeah, we
cool.
should mention that, because I don't think that we have. Because if you haven't seen the movie, he has taken a vow of silence and has been for 9 months, I believe, at the time of the movie. And he refuses to speak until he gets into the Air Force Academy, which will never happen.
Yeah, the scene where they're just riding in the car and he discovers that he's colorblind based on an eye test picked up at the hospital after his grandfather's death.
On a whim.
Realizes he's colorblind and that he will not be able to fly jets, and then speaks his first word of the entire movie by screaming into the heavens, fuck.
The big punch, obviously.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that scene for a hot second, though, because the way Frank turns around and just like, you're colorblind, you can't fly jets, just really pissed me off. Because I'm like, my dude, you couldn't wait 3 days to tell him this? You have to break his mind now when you're 100 miles away from your ultimate goal? You can't...
Perhaps he didn't realize the repercussions, but... I mean,
when you're silent for 9 months and you know it, there's no way you don't recognize the repercussions.
Yeah. I feel like it's interesting because it's a failure based on something that's not in his control at all. You know what I mean? Like, we talked about how winning and losing is a big theme of this movie. This is him failing at his goal due to genetics, due to just how his body works.
I mean, that's the other thing, too, is it's all about overcoming, which he is very positive that he will find a way to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a whole segment with Frank and Dwayne talking about how, it doesn't matter, life is shitty, but we're going to try and find a way to overcome it. Life is, what was the Proust quote?
Suffering makes you who you are.
Exactly. So they'll find a way to become who they are, and Dwayne will find a way to fly anyway, and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
But it just, the way he's just like, you're not gonna fly. Cool. That feels pertinent right now. Nice work.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Also, it should be noted, I guess, that Dwayne is heavily influenced by philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Who I did not look into at all, really, but I assume probably has some thoughts on suffering and/or failure based on the themes of the movie.
Yeah, he's a little bit of a nihilistic dude.
Okay, that checks out.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Like the whole, and actually, oh man, all right. So, fun fact that I actually just kind of came to the realization of is Dwayne's color blindness is foreshadowed really early on. So if you pay attention to the things that he's got going on, it's all black and white and kind of grays, which originally is kind of played off as just like it's the kids thing going on. But at one point you see Frank asleep in the bed with Dwayne, or in the cot in Dwayne's room. And if you look, the whole scene is shot in like grays and black and white. It's like it's clearly still a color camera, but it's clearly designed to be through the eyes of someone who might be colorblind.
Interesting. I did not notice that.
That's the one thing that I did kind of pay a lot of attention to in this movie, just kind of from that moment, was just how they did use color. Just because like a lot of indie movies tend to do a lot of interesting things with color in that regard. And yeah, it's all very kind of muted black and whites when it's in his room, which at first blush just kind of feels like a teenager who's really into Nietzsche. So it's kind of cool to see that pay off now that upon review.
Yeah.
The other thing I did notice, and I can't, maybe you can have an opinion on this one. The hotel rooms, I don't know if you noticed, they sleep in 3 separate hotel rooms over one night, and it's the night that Edwin dies. Olive sleeps in the same room as Edwin. Frank and Dwayne share a room, and Cheryl and Richard share a room. And I don't know if you noticed, but each room is a very different color.
I did not notice.
Yeah, I was just kind of paying attention to it because I noticed the one that stood out to me was Olive and Edwin's room was bright purple, and clearly not the color of a standard motel room. So I was just kind of watching. Theirs was like bright purple. I'm pretty sure Frank and Dwayne's was like the muted beige, and I think Cheryl and Richard's was orange, which like Frank and Dwayne makes sense. They're in whites and darks the entire time. You know, it's they're very muted. They're the suffering of the movie. Cheryl and Richard had like the red going on, which I got kind of like an angry vibe. They're fighting the whole time in there.
Yeah, conflict.
And then like the purple was kind of what I was kind of thrown by from Olive and Edwin.
It's a wild card, which I guess they both are. So speaking of Olive, should we move on to Olive? Is there anything else to say about Dwayne?
I think I'm good.
My favorite Dwayne quote from this is "Do what you love and fuck the rest." By the way.
I mean, a solid theme for the movie, admittedly.
Yeah, I do think that that's a good, like, were it not profane, a tagline.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's talk about Olive. Let's dive into the last character, the sweet, preteen girl who just wants things to be happy. Yeah,
she is very into pageants, and the opening scene is her watching a beauty pageant and mimicking the face of a beauty queen who wins Miss America. She meets Miss California or something at the pageant and then gets to participate in the pageant and all that kind of stuff. And so she's kind of the driving force for why the entire movie takes place. And she's also the only one that pretty much stays the Little Miss Sunshine.
Hey.
Throughout. In that, I mean, she's obviously sad when her grandpa dies, but she's able to turn that around and motivate herself to do her performance that he helped her with.
What a performance.
What a performance, yes. To the iconic Super Freak.
Like you would at a children's beauty pageant, of course. Like
with choreography that includes, you know, removal of clothing as you get, you know, at a children's beauty pageant.
I mean, you know, toddlers and tiaras. Like, how many episodes have we seen that haven't ended in that? Right? Like, come on.
It's so strange and hilarious, and it's so uncomfortable just knowing that her grandfather taught her all of those moves.
Yes.
But it's also just so funny.
Yes. Yeah. The idea of her grandfather teaching her those things was deeply unsettling.
Other than that, I mean, I don't have a lot. Like, Olive does struggle with some body image stuff. Like, they talk a little bit about within the winners and losers theme for her, some of that is based on appearance because obviously beauty pageants. And there's a part where they go to a diner and she asks the waitress what a la mode means, and she tells her, oh, it means it comes with ice cream. And so she orders ice cream, and her dad, ever the supporter of his children and their dreams, goes, you know, beauty queens that win pageants are skinny, and people that are skinny don't eat ice cream. But then we are later, you know, it is revealed that Miss California, that is helping judge the pageant, does in fact eat ice cream, and her dad is terrible, and we knew that already, so.
Yeah. Richard's, he is, a dick.
Yep. Appropriately named.
Yeah,
Richard.
yeah.
But yeah, so I think a lot of Olive's stuff with body image and everything is, again, like, she decides that being happy with herself is more important than being what she would need to be to win the beauty pageant necessarily.
Right. I mean, I guess let's tie everything back into theme at this point, if we've kind of covered the family and whatnot, because that is the idea of it all, is throughout all this death and suffering, it is kind of more about the journey than the destination, I suppose. In a way, that's not exactly it. But, like, it is about, you know, being happy and finding happiness in who you are, not in where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as we've said before, suffering makes you who you are. So all of those things that they had to get through to get to the end and get to the beauty pageant and dance together and be a happy family, everything that went right and everything that went wrong brought them there. So
yeah. I guess the question comes is, do you have anything else you want to say? Do we want to wrap this one up?
I mean, I feel like that's a pretty good place to stop. I feel like we talked about everything that I found interesting in the movie for the most part. I did just want to point out, just again, I just put some stuff down as I was watching. Some of my favorite quotes that I heard. Sarcasm is the refuge of losers, which I found funny. And also, fun fact, the writer of this also helped write Toy Story 3, which is just wild.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And what else? Oh, I think I don't remember if it was on the posters or if it's just the line that has stuck the most from this movie, because I've definitely seen it in, like, edits of art of some of the movie. But there's a part where they get pulled over by the cops, and they have, we didn't even talk about how the grandpa ends up in the trunk of the car.
Oh yeah.
Speaking of treating death with a little bit of levity, the sequence of the grandpa's corpse being lifted out of the hospital window out to the trunk, and then being in the trunk of the car when the funeral home comes to pick him up. All of that is really good. Yeah. And also the cop pulling them over and noticing the pornography magazines in the backseat and not the dead body. All of that is very good and very hilarious.
With the horn blaring, the broken horn?
Yes, and the having to run to push the car. Again, just the entire quest is very uphill with the wind against you. There's nothing easy about the trip at all, ever.
Yeah, there's a whole lot, actually, that we really didn't cover that kind of adds to the farce that is this journey. So I do think I would recommend this one, honestly, just as a weird.
I think it's a good movie.
Weird movie.
But the quote that summed it up, Greg Kinnear, when the cop pulls up, goes, "Everyone just pretend to be normal, okay?" Which I identify with, because I feel that needs to be said to myself and others on a regular basis.
Yeah, just pretend. It's all good. Just pretend, lean into it.
But yeah, so and I also wanted to point out that this movie did win an Oscar for Best Screenplay, which I think is appropriately won, and got some nominations for some other things. But yeah, I think it's a funny movie, it's a sad movie, it's a truthful representation of family and how not every family is always, happy all the time, but that doesn't mean that they're less of a family, and winning isn't everything. Being around people that you love is.
Yeah, that's, you know what, for once I feel like we're at a good place to wrap this up, so I'm gonna take this as an excuse to say Jackson's not here. We end the episode on an uplifting note for a change, considering half the time we're like, well, here's the theme on why death is terrible and we should all be sad, and instead say everything's all right, everyone's friendly, everyone's happy, it's good for once. So thank you, Cori. Thank you for bringing this podcast to a positive note.
Just trying to be Little Miss Sunshine.
There you go. If you want more of the podcast and stuff like that, you can follow the podcast at BADH_cast on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at Sean_McKinnon, as well as my website, isortof.com. Cori, anything you would like to plug? I'm going to give you one more opportunity.
I'm a teacher, so I'm going to keep my social media private to keep my job secure.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So instead, I'm just going to say thank you, Cori. She was absolutely wonderful. We're so happy to have her on the podcast for this episode, and it was a great opportunity to do something that we would have never really ever thought about doing, because I don't know that Jackson or I had ever seen this movie before, and I don't think it would have crossed our minds ever. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back at some point. Shout outs to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternate Take off the album High Octane Low Expectation. And shout outs to 25 Years Later Site.com. They have a lot of really cool stuff that they're doing right now with TV, movies, stuff like that. They've got a whole bunch of stuff on David Lynch, Twin Peaks, all that good stuff. And next week is going to be something. Just leave it at that. Any closing remarks?
Nope, I think I'm good. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go